Welcome everyone to the IAPP web conference, Consumer Perspectives on Data Privacy and Implications for Business Growth, sponsored today by Ketch. My name is Jordan Hardy, Programming and Speaker Specialist here at the IAPP, and I'll be your host for today's program. We'll be getting started with the presentation in just a minute, but before we do, a few program details. Participating in today's web conference will automatically provide IAPP certified privacy professionals, who are the name registrants, with 1 CPE credit. I also want to let you know that a recording of this program will be available in your My IAPP My Purchases portal within 48 hours. So what that means is if you log in at the top right of our website, and then you click on My Purchases, you'll see the recording title, click on that, and you'll see the video as well as the slides too. Please feel free to post any questions you have for the panelists in the Q&A area, specifically at the bottom of the screen, please. Now onto our program. I'd like to introduce today's panelists. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Joseph, Chief Solutions and Marketing Officer at Ketch. I'd also like to introduce Ariel Garcia, Chief Privacy Officer at UM Worldwide. It's a pleasure to have you both. We're looking forward to this conversation. And with that, I will hand it over to you.
All right. Hey, thanks, Jordan. And thanks everybody for joining us. We've got a lot of interest in this topic. Ariel and I have kind of talked about this before. Now we have the benefit of this study behind us, so we're keen to share the results. A lot of folks on the webinar, but we're happy to take questions and we'll try to answer those kind of as we go. Ariel, you've got a really interesting role at UM. Tell us a bit about it and kind of why you're such a key part, such a key voice here.
Sure. So I'm Chief Privacy Officer at UM. UM is a global media agency. And the thing that makes my role a little bit unique is that it actually sits on the business side of the organization. And so what that means is, as a media agency, we support our clients in, developing and activating media strategy, reaching their consumers where they are, et cetera. From a privacy standpoint, then we're also needing increasingly to support our clients in reaching those consumers in ways that align to the brand's requirements, compliance needs, interpretations, and particularly in the privacy space, where, as we all know, there's a pretty big spectrum of ambiguity and thus, as a result, approaches and interpretations. We kind of play matchmaker, helping our clients navigate their evolving standards and matching them to media partners that have solutions aligned to that, or an approach to privacy and data collection and use that's aligned to that.
Awesome. Thanks, Ariel. It's so good to see you here. Well, let's get started on this and kind of give people a little intro to the study. We're calling it the person behind the data. Ariel was heavily involved with this. Ketch sponsored this study with Magna and UM. What we're looking for here is people's perspectives on privacy. And where we're trying to get to is to try to understand what are some of the carrots rather than the sticks, right? Like, we know about the regulatory threats and we know about the fines, but what does the consumer want here? What are some of those drivers to start to engage marketing and data people? We like to say privacy is a team sport. So this gives us a lot of that ammunition to start to do that. And we'll roll through the study. It's a lot of charts, but Ariel, let's stop and pause and we'll kind of chat through, get your perspective here. So our idea here is to focus on how people feel about data privacy, how they value it relative to other values that brands like to share with consumers or say that they share with consumers. But the key to it is to get to some business impact, to try to understand, how do you quantify the value that people put behind data privacy? We knew going into this that they would care about it, but some of the results were surprising relative to other values. And then we've got, what we like to call the money slide here, where we've put some real numbers behind what this means for brands. And I think, Ariel, to your point, right, this helps bring in other stakeholders, especially if you're looking for budget, and especially if you're looking for budget in times like this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I know in my role, because it is a little bit unique and doesn't live under or report into the legal side of the organization, I am constantly balancing achieving both, finding solutions that meet consumer expectations of privacy while also enabling the brands that we serve to continue to drive personalization and deliver to consumer expectations for that as well. So to your point, Jonathan, it's definitely a conversation that involves collaboration on all sides: marketing, privacy, legal, IT, consumer experience, and hopefully this data can help support some of those conversations and make it clear why privacy is truly a business imperative and not exclusively a compliance obligation.
Oh, I love it. All right, let's roll. So some of the, just to start on some of the logistics of the study, it was focused on consumers. So it's focused on people that are actually making the purchase decisions in the home, making the travel decisions, making the grocery, the credit card decisions. So 76% of those of the people studied were consumers make this primary decision. So here's the first piece, and this wasn't a surprise, right, Ariel? People highly value their data privacy. And when we say 74% of people, what we're saying here is that basically data privacy has breadth. A lot of people care about it. And when they do care about it, they care about it quite highly. So you can see, we asked people, how do you value it 0 to 10? And 74% of people said, look, it's up there on my list, it's 8 to 10. But here's what I was surprised by. Relative to sustainability, diversity and inclusion, and we picked these, there's other ones that we kind of threw in here as well. We picked these because these are the types of values that brands like to share with consumers, right? They like to say, hey, we care about this thing as well. We care about the environment, we care about D&I. I was surprised to see that more people care about data privacy. And Ariel, I'd love to get your thoughts here on some of the reasons why you think that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and this is going to sound so obvious when I say it out loud, but there's a tendency to forget that privacy is personal, right? At its core, it's about personal data. And this is something that every consumer faces every day, every time they pick up their smartphone. Increasingly during the pandemic, when their kids were logging on to online schooling from their living rooms and the like, and even people that were not as reliant perhaps on technology really needed to be during the height of the pandemic, certainly. And so I just think that this is one where there's an immediate and personal connection to the issue of privacy, in particular with all of the headlines around data misuse and social media and all of that. So that's kind of my theory. I also think that with some of the other ones like sustainability, for example, people can do their part and feel that they can do their part, certainly to drive a more sustainable future. Whereas I think what we hear and what I'm sure we'll get into from a privacy standpoint as we go through the rest of the results is part of the issue is the feeling of lack of control, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's another thing that amplifies this concern for consumers.
Yeah, this idea that it's a deeply personal, this affects me today type issue is as we've been doing the rounds with this, it's certainly been the consensus. By the way, I think people are asking if these slides will be available. Absolutely. I should note, this is a US study, but we did, and so some of the slides you're seeing today are US focused. We also ran this study in the UK, and both of those studies will be available to you. And where some of the results were different, we're going to touch on those here. But when you're looking to download the slides, there'll be a US and UK version. All right, so here's the thing. So people value data privacy highly, and a lot of people care about it, but they're concerned, right? They're concerned about how that data is being gathered and used by companies. So I think consumers, kind of more than I thought, 82% said companies aren't doing this right. And when we asked and we dug in on what aren't they doing right specifically, what came up was basically transparency and control. I don't understand what you're doing with my data, how long you're keeping it for. I don't have adequate control over what you're doing. And this issue of control is interesting. The issue of transparency is interesting. We've talked about this before. I mean, cookie banners just aren't they're just not transparency, right? They're just, people swat them away. They don't know what they're doing. My personal view here, I'd love to hear what you think, Ariel, is people need to know what you're doing with data, right? It's like the old school GDPR, like processing purpose. What are you doing? Are you running analytics? Is it for advertising? But what are your thoughts there on both of these? Were you surprised by this?
No, not at all surprised. As you know well, I am always advocating for greater transparency and choice for consumers, both again from a compliance standpoint, but also because it's what people actually want. So not at all surprising. What I would say is that one thing, and I'm not sure if it's, I think it's covered in the broader study. what we've consistently seen is that consumers are very concerned about what they can't see, right? They don't know who their data is being shared with. One earlier study I had read focused on the fact that consumers that are given more granular choices may be more likely to opt down versus opt out, right? So there's a heightened concern as it relates to oftentimes what happens to data when it's shared with third parties, right? And so by providing that transparency and choice to consumers and giving them the ability to see what third parties and for what purpose it's shared and all of that, it might serve to alleviate some of those fears. And I think that this kind of highlights that at a macro level.
Yeah, I was surprised it was so broad, but also that the benefits were broad. So we're going to quantify the impact of this later, but it's not just about revenue and growth, which are important. It's also about we'll trust the company more. We prefer this brand over others. We'll support the company, which I thought was interesting. Like what does that mean to support the company? But to be an advocate of the company, tell others about the company. Some of these aren't directly quantifiable, but I think the main takeaway is you do some of this right. You flow, there's a lot of benefits that flow. And I think there's a first mover advantage here. Right.
Look at Apple, right?
Yeah.
Like, look at the way that Apple's positioned themselves as privacy protector. And, we could have an entire session on the accuracy of that or not. But I think the important thing there is by leaning into that messaging and being consistent about how vocal they are around protecting their consumers' privacy, there's certainly a market advantage and a unique positioning that they've earned the right to with consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think good for brands to start to follow in some of those footsteps. And we're going to talk about how to do that exactly. So let's talk about the control piece here a little bit. I know this is near and dear to your heart, Ariel. We ask people, what do you want? Do you want cookies? And you can see it there. They don't. Do you want more transparency on what people are doing with data, which is what we call purpose-based permissions? Yes, they do that. But there's this idea that it's not just about privacy preferences. There's an extension of preferences that include marketing. And I mean, marketing and communication choices, that was off the charts here. So this helps you, right? You were into this slide. Tell us about it.
Yeah, no, I'm so excited about this. So one of the things that occurred to me a while ago is, when I think about myself as a consumer, I want to manage my privacy and data sharing choices in the same place that I want to manage my communication preferences with a brand. And I think that that's what we're seeing here. It's what's reflected in that verbatim, right? By having that more granular ability to choose what pieces of information you're sharing, how often you're hearing from a brand about what in particular, this supports the reality that you'll increase consumer engagement because you're enabling them to share information that lets you provide actual personalization in a way that's meaningful to them versus hypothesizing in macro level or aggregate insights what they might find compelling. And actually, that's something that I'm excited about with this study generally, right? Because I think we've all had discussions about privacy and preference management best practice. And the thing that was glaringly missing is asking people what they want out of their privacy and preference experience. So seeing that consumers agree that having an integrated and streamlined way to manage their relationship with a brand, while not surprising, is incredibly helpful data.
And Ariel, it's streamlined is such a key part of this, right? Because what we're not saying is consumers want to make a choice on every little thing, and you present this huge menu of things they need to decide on, right? And yeah, good, because it's, as we kind of did, we're doing a little roadshow with this deck and kind of talking to the analysts, and that was one of the things that came up. Like at some point in time, there's a trust factor here that consumers may want to go back and make changes and kind of articulate their preferences. And that's a big element of control, but what they actually want is just to be able to trust a brand that they're doing the right thing with data.
And I think and to underscore your point, like this is not an exercise in new and exciting dark patterns. They will always want and need to have the ability to reject all. But this is about giving people sufficient transparency to engender that trust. And if they want to, the ability to more selectively curate the information they're sharing and with what brands and for what reason.
Yeah, thanks. And to answer the question online there, this was a study of 5,000, just over 5,000 people across the US and UK, and also focus groups. And so when you download the study, you'll see some videos like Marilee's and in her own voice talking about what this means to her. Okay, so let's keep rolling. So here, this is the part I loved, Ariel. This idea that consumers are saying, look, we really highly value data privacy, but sending a message to business to say, you're not doing this right. But then turning around and saying, but if you do this right, I understand the value exchange. I understand that that data is at the center of, I give my data to brands and we come back with benefits and all the rest of it. I don't think I gave consumers that much credit that they understand this value exchange, but they absolutely do. They perceive the benefit. What was interesting about this also is this is the US cohort here. The benefits that they talk about, I want to learn about new products, right? Obviously the upsell opportunity. I want to have a personalized experience, and receive a benefit from the company means a discount. What was interesting in the UK study is these were flipped. The discount was up top, the learning about new products was third. Curious what you thought, Ariel, when you saw this.
Yeah, so I mean, first to take a step back, one thing I love about this slide as being someone that again sits on the business side of the organization is this demonstrates the power and the need for collaboration between privacy, legal, IT, marketing, and CX, right? Because for the marketers in your organizations in particular, this understanding of what people find to be of value is incredibly helpful. As marketers face, third-party and on all of the industry-driven changes that are impacting their marketing programs, that's happening in parallel to everything that the privacy side of the house and the legal side of the house is navigating from a compliance standpoint. And so this demonstrates the benefit, the opportunity truly of having that unified and consistent and cross-functional approach to all of this. In terms of what benefits and why they would be flipped, I think, I wonder how much the UK has been seeing in their cookie notices and all of the disclosures, and if we all can think back to like the email apocalypse that was GDPR taking effect and all of the emails that we received about updates to privacy notices. I'm wondering if they've heard this messaging around like sharing data or consenting in order to have a personalized experience so many times, and where they may have selected that, nothing's changed, and when they didn't select it, nothing changed also. And so I think that just underscores that first point, right? To do this right, you really need to have that collaboration, because the entire future of effective marketing communication hinges on this value exchange.
Yeah, privacy is a team sport, as we like to say. And I'm with you on the UK point. It kind of maybe through GDPR made some of these a little more front and center for people. But yeah, so that I thought this was super interesting, that consumers innately understand this, and they're basically saying, do this right and you'll be rewarded basically as a company. But the important theme here, Ariel, and this was a theme that I think is going through this whole deck in the study, is that there's a context here that matters. And so the UK is going to be different to the US. The types of data people care about based on the industry that you're in as a company, based on where they're located, is going to be different. This is a little bit of an eye chart, but why I think this slide is important is what we asked is, for different things that companies look at, types of data that they look at, like things that you've bought or your entertainment habits, like data that they have access to. For each one of those benefits, a free product sample, a discount on future purchases, a personalized experience, we ask consumers which types of data you're comfortable sharing and which ones you aren't. And I'm showing the US and the UK here because they're so different. For example, in the US, personal financial info, people said maybe that's okay. Don't really care that much about that. If you share that, I thought that was interesting. But contents of email, that was a no-go, right? In the UK, personal financial info was up there, almost asking the question, why would you need that to give me a free product sample? Why would you need my financial info for a personalized experience? And of course, different based on what segment you're in. But this is I think this for me highlights what you were saying, Ariel, about the context matters here, and there's nuance, and we need to get to that nuance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's a fine line between relevance and intrusiveness. And this kind of highlights that reality. And it's why, through that cross-functional collaboration, companies are able to refine their data strategy and their marketing strategy in alignment with what their specific consumers expect of their brand. If you're in financial services, personal financial info and sharing that for personalization may not feel intrusive. That would be very different if you're talking about, I don't know, a clothing brand. Right. And so beginning to really understand what types of information people are willing to share and what they find to be a compelling benefit in exchange for that information helps to land one's brand on that relevant personalization side of the line versus, the creepy line that has historically been crossed and fractured consumer trust.
And Ariel, this is your day-to-day, right? This idea that we're intertwining data strategy and privacy and really thinking about it from a data lens, right?
Yeah, and this is what makes it so powerful, right? Because from a business standpoint, we now know, and this particular cut is not cut by vertical, right? But with this information, one's brand can figure out what types of offers to prioritize, what their consumers would find compelling. As they're developing audience strategy, they can be respectful of the types of information that their consumers and consumers that are similar to their consumers would find to be responsible for them to use in reaching them, right? So this is the exact intersection at which I sit. And so certainly, I think this is probably my favorite part of this study.
Oh, good. One of the points to note here, look at the location piece, right? So sharing location data. And one of the reasons why I want to focus on that is, in the US, obviously after the Dobbs ruling, this was done before that. So this to make that point, this study was run before the Dobbs ruling, before Roe v. Wade was overturned. And since then, location data has become super sensitive. And so I could argue that if we did this again, location data for a lot of these could be read. And I was curious to hear some of your comments there, Ariel, and especially what we're seeing with femtech products and period trackers and.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great point, and it also underscores the importance of maintaining that open line of dialogue with consumers on an ongoing basis, because things do change and sentiment will shift. And on location data in particular, I agree with you. I think that we would likely see a shift in how amenable people in the US are to sharing this for free product samples. That said, what I would also say is, as we move through the rest of the deck and some of the action items, like there are some times where consumers will absolutely still share their location information as it's a core part of the service they're receiving, right? So for example, finding the nearest ATM, right? There are reasons that people may choose to share their precise location information in exchange for a particular service. But I think what this also highlights is, what about working with data partners that provide location information? That's a completely different context to using data to provide the exact service that a person's requested. So the kind of, and in the case of where it is part of the service, of course, that's where security related and retention related controls, processes, et cetera, come into play. But as it relates to this portion of location data that might be used not in alignment with the reasonable expectations of a consumer, that's also what this starts to highlight. And so that's the heuristic I like to use when I talk about this, is if the individual understood that they were receiving an ad because of their precise location or because of their demographic information or, you know, something that they were interested in, would they find that particular thing to be fair, relevant, enable them to receive a relevant offer that they appreciate, or would they find it to be intrusive, pervasive, or creepy?
Yeah, absolutely. And so many dimensions to this, because there's the don't be creepy factor. There's the let's be kind of reasonable, but also to your point on the stick, like, you know, I recall Lena Khan's presentation, her keynote at the IAPP conference in DC, where she said, look, consent and notice are kind of outdated models, right? And what will replace consent and notice is things like data minimization, is focus on types of data and how they're used. And you see some of that in this federal law that's being proposed, right? And I catch myself wondering, you know, going state by state in the US, somewhat burdensome for folks, right? We're trying to solve for that. The federal law doesn't necessarily solve for easy administration, because now you've got to think about granular data. So this idea that data strategy and privacy start to really be intertwined, I think is only becoming more important. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And it's also why I use the heuristic I just kind of referenced, because it's more about skating to where the puck is going, to the benefit not only of mitigating risk, but also driving business outcomes, right? So if we take that example, one doesn't need to necessarily parse through requirements and have a solution for jurisdiction specific treatment if it's one of those topics where they've just decided that this piece of information is not a piece of information they want to be collecting. So we have some partners, for example, that are location data partners specifically, and they have stopped collecting information near around what they've defined as, in a new policy, sensitive points of interest. Right. And so there are certainly things that can be done to skate to where the puck is going, that leave one well positioned and needing less to navigate those nuances, or in navigating those nuances, less change is required.
Gotcha. Yeah, and we could talk about this for ages. When we send this report out, actually, if people have comments on it and additional perspectives, we'd love to hear those as well. So let's get to the bottom line. This is where we really quantified a lot of the benefit here. So the way we looked at this, and we kind of tested, 320 different scenarios. Company A does this, company B does that, and kind of tweaked some of the differences. The categories where we looked here is we looked at how much data are you collecting? And we asked, what are you collecting? What's essential to what you're trying to do? Analytics, personalized advertising, whatever the case may be. Or are you kind of collecting as much as possible, not really knowing what you're going to do with it? Maybe we'll do something with it later. We asked about transparency, and transparency in how you're collecting data, what you're collecting, how you're using it, including transparency on control mechanisms. Are you fully transparent or not transparent at all? We asked about the retention period. We didn't call it the retention period, but we talked about storing data for the appropriate, relevant amount of time. And we purposely didn't define it as 18 months or 12, just appropriate, versus just kind of keeping data, which we know people were doing this, right? Companies were just keeping it. Let's see what happens. Maybe it'll be useful later. And then lastly, the extent of data sharing. Are you sharing with other companies versus not sharing at all? And we asked this across different verticals. And what we're focused on here today is purchase intent. How do these variables impact how much a consumer will spend with your brand? But when you download the study, you'll also see we looked at trust, we looked at brand preference, we looked at that across verticals. So this is the money slide for me. What we call responsible data practices, which is basically doing the right thing across those 4 dimensions. If you do that, measured against the baseline, in the US, it drives 23% more purchase intent for your brand. In the UK, it was much higher, it was 27%. Now, purchase intent is the idea that I want to spend money with your brand. It then filters down into revenue. But the point is, this is the slide that helps you get budget, right? This is the slide that I think articulates the carrot, right? This idea that, yes, we should worry about regulations, but shouldn't we worry about the consumer and their expectations as well? And consumers are telling us, I will spend more money with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this also underscores, increasingly consumer expectations of brands is shifting. And so consumers expect the brand to live its values increasingly on issues of social impact, on issues of environmental impact. And this underscores the trend that we've seen. I think it was Apple and Google and one other tech company at a recent conference were talking about seeing privacy as an ESG issue. This really underscores that consumers are speaking with their wallets when it comes to issues of social impact. Privacy is certainly an area of social impact, and this helps to be the tie that binds by demonstrating the business results related specifically to privacy in ways where, you know, it's been more readily showable that people invest with their wallets when it comes to sustainability, right? So this starts to get at the same for privacy and break it out of that compliance exclusive bucket and into something that is a business imperative, and for executives across the organization to be aware of.
Yeah, so it's thinking back to the last time we did a webinar on this, and we asked ourselves, for example, our marketing teams, our CMOs jumping into privacy conversations. And I think at the time, they were kind of, but not really. And where they were, it was customer experience, right? It was the folks that ran the website, the look and feel. Now we're making a case that they absolutely need to show up. And if you weren't motivated by the stick, which I don't blame them, right, for not being motivated by regulations, but now we're saying consumers want this, they're going to spend more money with you. We're getting good feedback online. Actually, someone just asked, how would a consumer know that a company is responsibly using their data? So let's talk about that. Okay, so I'm going to show US and UK because actually they were very different. And I was surprised at why they were different. And I want to actually go deep with that with you, Ariel, and try and discuss that a little bit. So in the US, breaking up that 23%, what were the components? How did they contribute to that? The biggest one by far was this idea that you're not keeping data for as long as you can. And so this idea that the retention period, keeping data for an appropriate amount of time, was the biggest driver for US consumers. I was a little surprised by that. I've rationalized it in my mind kind of since then. But tell us, Ariel, like, what was your reaction when you saw that? What do you think?
I had a similar reaction to you. So the way that I've rationalized this in my head is a couple of things. Number one, I see retention period as being a proxy for security concerns and the concerns that we've seen echoed around control over data and not knowing how data is shared. If you take those two things and you put them together, it makes sense as to why retention period and increasing the time horizon that a company has data would raise concerns. At the same time, retention period is reflective of truly a company's attempts to provide personalization in a way that's actually effective and successful, right? If a company is retaining data for an extended period of time, in a lot of cases, it's going to be stale and not enable the business outcomes that one would collect that data for in the first place, right? So I know, JJ, when we were talking about this, I was talking about where I was 5 years ago and how that would have been, you know, a very different place from now, and even 12 months ago, right? The interests I had may have shifted, right? For many people, where they're employed may have shifted. And so I think that this stat on retention period demonstrates in a way, a consumer's belief that the brand's use of data is aligned to their expectations and providing value to them versus like data hoarding exclusively to the benefit of, or predominantly to the benefit of that company.
So much, yeah. Oh, there's so much nuance there. So yeah, first, totally with you. I think consumers innately understand that if you keep data for a long time, it increases its risk of data breach and whatnot. But the other part of it is, yes, you're right, it decreases its value. Who I was, who you were 5 years ago, very different life stages. So what use is that data to you anyway? And one of the things that's fascinated me here is I wonder if companies know this. I think they do. The longer you keep data, the risk goes up, but the value decreases. So if you've got now this risk profile going up on data you've kept for years, but also it's of no value to you, why not flush that out?
Yeah, and I saw we just got a question about the retention period and how organizations are sharing their retention period. And I would say, number one, there's the obvious, like, via their privacy policy, which we all know is not where consumers are going to be finding it, at least not right now, when the vast majority are still legalese and not consumer friendly necessarily, right? But what I would say that that's important here is, I'm sure we've all been on the receiving end of an email that is just completely irrelevant to us in one way or another. Like, for example, buy this car, like, we have an offer for you regarding a car purchase or car financing when you just bought a car a month ago. Like, that is one way that people would understand the retention period for their data. Whereas when I was logging into my bank account the other day and I was asked to review my information for accuracy because they want to make sure that they're providing relevant offers. Seems logical. I appreciated it, and I updated my information for that reason. So I think that there are a few ways that retention period can manifest from a transparency standpoint.
Yeah, transparency and trust. No, absolutely. And then data minimization being second here. Oh, I was surprised transparency was third, but we'll talk about, we'll see what it has for the UK. But data minimization, obviously top of mind. Do you think it's for relatively the same reasons, or do you think something else?
No, I do. I think that data minimization is also a proxy for security concerns. I also think that the early rhetoric in the US, so if we think back to Cambridge Analytica, it was kind of positioned as like a security related thing back when privacy was a bit of a taboo and not like on everyone's radar every day and a topic for dinner table conversation. So I think that this is just reflective of the US's focus and positioning of some of these issues in public discourse, at least, for a longer period of time as security related. And then also, I know in some of the verbatims that are part of the broader study, we saw people talk about just specific pieces of information that they wish they didn't have to give. And so I think that it's also reflective of that. And from a transparency standpoint, when we think about the mechanisms for people to receive transparency and choice today, it's what I was just talking about, how the privacy policy for people to actually read that today, it's onerous and it's not incredibly helpful, as someone pointed out in the Q&A, right? And so I think if people perceive the fix to that to be an even more specific privacy policy or a longer set of terms and conditions, it makes sense as to why that would not rank high. But if we think about things like, Twitter recently had updated their privacy policy to include they gamified it. They turned it into a game, an interactive game. So I think as we see those more consumer friendly avenues to explaining how data is collected and used, this would shift. But today it's just a proxy for yet more text that consumers don't really want to have to read.
Yeah, gotcha. No, that's interesting. To answer a question that came up in the chat here about the major difference between data minimization and retention period. Retention period is keeping that data, how long you're keeping it for. Data minimization is not collecting it in the first place if you don't need it. All right. Well, let's see what it looks like in the UK. So in the UK, transparency off the charts. And look, we're also saying, don't use this to just do one of these things. You kind of have to do all of these things. We'll see why later. But for transparency to drive purchase intent in the UK this significantly, what do you think of that, Ariel? Like, what was behind that?
Yeah, so I think in the UK, where GDPR has been in effect throughout the region for some time, and the rest of it may be more spoken to by regulation, where there is a differentiator for companies may well be in their transparency. So it's almost like an accelerated timeline of what we were talking about that we will see in the US, and why that the fairness of that value exchange is so critical. That was accelerated in across the EU, inclusive of the UK, because of GDPR, where providing that level of transparency into how a company is using data may have actually influenced someone's decision to consent or not. And then I think it also would highlight really distinct approaches, right? There was the swath of companies that were relying on legitimate interest in ways that may no longer be valid. That would stand in stark contrast to a good faith effort to provide transparency. And so I think we're also seeing the effect of some of that here.
Yeah, so that makes me think, if the regulations were so visible in the UK, as we know, that drove this, you could argue as they become more visible in the US, maybe transparency starts to become more important there, which is more of a reason to do all of these things rather than try to pick and choose or prioritize. All right, awesome. So let's talk about this by vertical. So we looked at 4 types of companies: finance, travel, retail, telecom. We asked very similar questions. And this is, like, for me to see this, first of all, people see telecom and they see data minimization, and everybody just says, of course, right? Phone companies have so much data on us, and internet companies and whatnot. So of course, data minimization is going to be important. For me, the main thing here is, we could use this to understand nuance. Who are you as a brand? What are some of these things? But you should still do all of them, right? I mean, what was your reaction here, Ariel, when you saw some of the different responses here by vertical?
Yeah, a little bit of the same as yours, in that when I saw finance and data sharing practice, it basically just confirmed a hypothesis for me personally, right? And also really paid off the point that the context matters, and taking the same approach to data strategy across verticals is not the right approach, because it's fundamentally not aligned to these nuances and distinctions in consumer expectation that are bred from the nature of their relationship with a particular brand. So that was the one that stood out to me, but I completely agree. This is not an either or exercise. It just underscores some of that nuance that highlights the importance of considering your brand's specific relationship with your consumers, and what they prioritize in their expectations from your brand.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, like you do these studies, you try to do them objectively, and then you try to rationalize the results, right? And so as I was trying to rationalize the results here, where it led me was, consumers innately understand what's behind the onion here as you peel it back. Like, for example, finance data sharing practices, as you pointed out, if you're a finance company, you have some pretty sensitive data on me, right? And so if you're sharing that, I'm going to have a problem, right? And retail data sharing, yeah, I'm spending with you, I'm buying things from you. Like, you understand who I am innately as a person, what I like in terms of brand versus brand. Are you sharing that? What are you doing with that data? They're sensitive to that. Similarly with telecom. And I always had, I think I gave the consumer a lot of credit for understanding some of these issues around brand and around data privacy. But now seeing this, just giving them much more credit, right? That they innately understand these issues, they innately understand the value exchange. It takes me back to soap operas and where soap operas came from, right? The idea was there was a social contract. It was, hey, we're going to give you P&G and others, we're going to give you this great entertainment, days of our lives, whatever the case may be. But in return, we're going to drop some advertising in between. And is that okay? And I think that was the start of this value exchange that consumers innately understand and they crave, and they're telling businesses, you're not doing this right,
Yeah, well, and I think, foundational to the value exchange is trust, right? And so some of these more foundational elements of responsible data practice serve as building that strong foundation in the first place, without which there could not be fairness in a value exchange or a willingness to participate in it. So I think that this really starts to highlight that as well. And I would also say, you know, this slide in particular adds depth to some other research on consumer trust, where, for example, financial services is seen as most trusted by consumers. So it makes sense then that there's also heightened expectation because of the sensitivity of that information. But you take that and you collaborate across your organization around future-proofing your data strategy and how you're going to reach your audience, and you start to get to a place that really aligns to and makes the most of your unique positioning as trusted to consumers, right? So for example, if I'm a financial services company, maybe it is about providing that additional granularity so that people can understand exactly why and control the data sharing preferences that they may have beyond what's required from a compliance standpoint, right? There are ways to really lean into this when you get down to the specifics of expectation by vertical that help companies really leverage the strength of their unique positioning with their consumers.
Yeah, I love that, Ariel. And just, you know, back to what you said at the top of the call, it's this, there's nuances, context here, and to unpack that context, you really need to bring in additional stakeholders to think about that, think about kind of where you are on this spectrum, and do all these things, right? I love some of the questions in the chat here. I love when people ask, you know, is there a breakdown between banks and insurance? We didn't go that granular, but we do have more granularity around how these impact brand preference and how they impact trust specifically, which will be in the deck when you download it. So what do we do about this, Ariel? Like, what's the kind of, as we leave here and go back to our day-to-day, what are some of the things we can take away? I'll let you lead this, and we've got some of the thoughts here, but
yeah, sure. And I think I'll preface all of this by saying step one is go share this across your org, because I think that this data is exactly what, certainly for me, it was helpful to really demonstrate that connection point between privacy and why it's a business imperative, where there's ROI associated. And so to that point, our first finding here around responsible data practices, building trust and being an opportunity for growth through that collaboration across your teams as they're looking towards, again, third-party cookie deprecation, industry and platform-driven changes, limitations from a regulatory standpoint, bringing both sides of the house together, not only to collaborate on strategy, but think about your tech investments, right? I'm seeing or was seeing a lot of conversations where marketing may be considering adding something to their MarTech stack or considering ad tech partnerships. And that's kind of happening in a silo from considerations around privacy tech, right? And so increasingly those things need to work together, not only from an investment efficiency standpoint, but to enable what brands are looking to do from a marketing standpoint. And in particular, as we look ahead to next year and the increasing need to integrate not only within your own first party assets, but also to communicate and honor rights and preferences downstream with your partners and ad tech providers, as an example, right? And so this really highlights that. In terms of,
we're seeing that people use this to get budget, right? Like I mean, we got budget for compliance initiatives with GDPR, like, hey, I have to do this, give me the budget right now. But now it's, well, there's another business angle here. There's a growth angle, and maybe it unlocks other budgets, right? Marketing budgets, data budgets, and whatnot.
yeah, 100%, because a lot of I've seen conversations around technologies that can support both on both sides. In some cases, it is coming from marketing budget, and in some cases, it's coming from legal budget, and it's more seen as OpEx. But I think that this brings those two groups together in a way that also demonstrates the potential for efficiency, but not just efficiency now, effectiveness later. right? By having the right technology, perhaps there are elements of marketing programs that the marketing managers and media teams have not considered yet would be impacted by evolving laws. So this is an opportune time to bring those conversations together for sure. And I think the second point underscores that even more, right? Providing transparency and choice does a couple of things. Number one, it'll increasingly be required from a compliance standpoint, especially when we think about the way that other regulation and legislation is trending internationally. If we think about like the transparency requirements that are part of the EU's Digital Services Act around people having information about what the key parameters were in delivering targeted advertising to them, we are shifting towards greater expectations from a regulatory standpoint and consumer standpoint around transparency and choice for sure. In exchange for that, as I mentioned earlier, more granular choice and a foundation of trust equals increased willingness and desire for a consumer to actually build a deeper connection with a brand. And so it's another perfect example of the power of collaboration cross-functionally on issues of privacy and responsible data collection and use.
Yeah, and actually we had a good question come up in the chat. I'm with you on that, Ariel. Transparency, choice, do the retention period thing. Like retention, actually, when we ask our clients at Ketch, what's the next thing you want to do, right? If you feel comfortable with your privacy program today, what's the next thing? And they almost always say, I want to be able to enforce my retention policy. I'm communicating it transparently with my consumers, but I actually want to be able to execute on that in a way that makes sense. So they're asking about this. Somebody asked in the chat, how do you manage state-by-state regulations when it comes to, do you do a one-size-fits-all or do you just kind of go state-by-state? Our view here, what we've seen is when it comes to consent, you want to go state-by-state. You want to preserve that consumer experience, right? So honor California opt-outs, honor it in all the data systems you have, which is an important point. Everybody can collect consent, everybody can collect an opt-out, but not a lot of folks in the privacy tech space actually enforce that choice across data systems. So I think that's important. Your consumers made a choice, you need to respect it. But the other side of it is on rights. And on rights, I think I'm not seeing state by state. I'm seeing brands take broader approaches because it's awkward, right? It's awkward to say, well, if you're in California, I'm going to let you delete your data. But if you're in New York, I'm not. And brands have said, look, if someone really wants to delete their data, regardless of where they are, I'm going to give them that choice and I'm going to respect that choice. What do you think, Ariel? Are you seeing similar?
Yeah, no, I'm seeing similar. And I think, part of it comes back to taking things out of the compliance bucket for a second. To Jonathan's point, there are things that are truly state-specific requirements where you're seeing state specificity. So like the opt-out is one example today, and opt-out of sale is a very specific thing. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't also see brands that have adopted industry mechanisms like DAA's ad choices as an example, right? And so you kind of need to separate the two and have like, these are the things where there are state specific requirements that are nuanced. And then these are the areas where we, as a matter of doing the right thing, or as a matter of making it easy for our consumers to manage their preferences, or as a matter of we don't want to waste our marketing budget reaching people that don't want to hear from us, which is another conversation I'm increasingly seeing happen. They'll implement methods, systems, and options for people to make those choices irrespective of their jurisdiction. So I think it's important to kind of decouple those conversations to some extent because of the point that I just made, where a lot of this, like one of the things that we've been seeing since CCPA took effect is, when you think about slowing down an opt-out, with everyone relying on the service provider relationships, a lot of it was like, okay, well, nothing to be done. But as a brand, again, do you want to continue to proactively, addressively reach individuals that don't want to hear from you? to them, it doesn't actually make a difference whether an entity is acting as a service provider or not. And so there's a broader conversation that, again, has its roots in bolstering that consumer trust and enabling business outcomes that comes from figuring out and adopting ways to honor preferences across the board.
Thanks for that example, Ariel. It's like, well, I'm not going to honor your deletion request because you're not in California, but also I have this service provider agreement and I'm going to, that's why I can keep this data. Trying to have that conversation with the consumer who just said, look, I want to opt out would be interesting. So 3, context matters. And I think what we're saying here is you don't need to take a broad brush. There's nuance here. And the way to unpack that nuance is basically do what you do on a daily basis, which is intertwine data strategy with privacy and have that be a team conversation, right? There's so many pieces. One of the things we hear a lot, actually, which is an anecdote I kind of think about every day. Chief data officers, when we talk to them, say, I don't have the confidence to use the data that's sitting in my organization. And I want to use it for machine learning and data science applications. And I can't because I don't know where it came from and the state of consent and do I have the right permissions? And so there's this idea that as you dig into data strategy and understand that, but also get to this point where you have this permissioned, responsibly gathered data set, it frees up data, right? It frees it up to be used a little more. And I think okay to use it more because consumers have said, I get it. I get it. Like, you're going to use this data to give me better experiences and it's okay. I just need to be able to trust you with it.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think this also goes back to the nature of the connection that a brand has with a consumer will vary based on the vertical it's in, the actual product it's offering. That is going to change the nature of how frequently the individual expects to be communicated with and what they would find annoying versus relevant. And the same exact thing applies to the way that their data is used and the information they're willing to share. So I think that the big takeaway here for me is consumers really should serve as the North Star. By delivering to what people's expectations are, we're better positioned to deliver both on compliance needs as well as on business outcomes.
Thanks, Ariel. What a good note to end on. That the consumer should be the North Star. Look, thanks for joining us. As always, Ariel, I love talking about this stuff with you, and thanks everybody for the great questions. This was a record for us. I think over 400 attendees, which was pretty crazy actually. How many people are interested in this topic? But Jordan, do you want to do your thing? I think we did the Q&A. Yep, all these are available. The UK study, the US study. Yeah, go for it.
Exactly. My thing is a little less interesting than how great this discussion was, but yeah, we got great feedback even in the Q&A. Thank you all for being so involved in the questions. And I keep getting this, so I'm going to mention again that if you go to your My IAPP portal, so just log into your account and then go to My Purchases, My Recordings, and that's where you'll find the slides and the video of the recording as well. But thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to Ketch for sponsoring today so that it could be free to the audience. And we hope to see you all on another IAPP web conference soon. And thanks, Ariel and Jonathan, of course.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ariel.
Thank you.
Bye.